But it was a testing of that faith. I don't hear the word testing like the way you think testing. Like it's a revelation of the heart. Okay, it's a revelation of the heart. A lot of what you'll see in these little moments will be, what do you really believe? You'll see it again next week in chapter 9. There's another great thing where God is like talking to a dad, and he's like, what is the heart really saying here? Right? What's the heart really saying? Because again, you're never going to get past the fact that the head versus the heart, and the heart's got to win. Got to. So that's why I like this story. I like the fact that it's like, Now, what is really interesting is that we move from this miracle, and quite honestly, there are very few miracles past this one. This one where he tests this guy's faith, and there's very few miracles past this one. Not miracle, I'm talking like healing miracles, because this next set of verses is just dead center in the middle of Mark, and most scholars believe not only is this the central theme of Mark's gospel, but it seems to be like a watershed moment in Mark's gospel, that everything up to this point Mark's talking about is, it's like the foundation, and then it's healing, and then he gets to this question that we're getting ready to read. And then from this point forward, it tends to be more, his account tends to be more about the teachings of Jesus. It's not that Jesus didn't do additional miracles. It's that Mark, sharing this account, kind of gets to this pinnacle. At least what they believe in terms of his account. He gets to this watershed moment to ask the question that is the question of all questions. So here we go. Jesus and his disciples left Galilee and went up to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And as they were walking around, he asked them, what do people say about me? Right? That's the NIV. Who do people say that I am? What's the word on the street? And you see this from one of the other stories we read. There were lots of skeptics, right? Well, they replied, some think you're John the Baptist, right? Raised back from the dead. Some say Elijah, right? Some just say you're one of the other prophets. Because there were lots of different ideas about who Jesus could be. And then he asked them, but who do you say that I am? Right? Who do you say that I am? Peter. Right? Peter says, you are the Messiah. Some translations say you are the Christ. Because Christ is not his last name, by the way. There's people new in the room. It wasn't Jesus Christ and Larry Christ and Susan Christ. It was Jesus the Christ, right? It was Jesus Christ as in for him, it was everything he enrolled, his title, his embodiment. So they say Jesus Christ, but that's what it means. The Messiah, the Hebrew word for Messiah is anointed one. It meant for them, it was a king, right? He was the king who was going to come from the branch of David, and the prophecies all pointed to the fact that the king was going to come back and restore the Jewish people to the glory days of the Jewish empire, and that they were going to, that there was going to be all their enemies would be vanquished. That's what they were waiting on. So when Peter says the Messiah, that's really what he's saying. Now, once again, let me read this last part. Mark, Jesus warned them not to tell anybody about this. Keep this on the DL, okay? There's a reason for that, and we're going to get to it in a minute. But before that, I want to go to Matthew. Again, Matthew sort of expands a little bit on Jesus' response to Peter. Because Peter says, you're the Messiah. You are the Christ. And Matthew tells us in this moment that Jesus' response was actually, look, Peter says, you are blessed, Simon, son of John. This is Peter. Because my Father in heaven has revealed this to you. Right? That was Jesus' nice way of saying, you're not that smart. Right? Like, good job, Peter. Well done. But God gave that to you. You didn't hear that. Matter of fact, he says, you didn't learn this from another human being. That's from my Father. And he goes on to say, now I say to you that you are Peter, which means rock, and upon this rock I will build my church. What's the rock? The rock is not Peter. Peter represented that. He's like, the rock is the fact that I am the Messiah. This is the watershed moment in history. I'm going to change it all, right? This is what I'm going to build the church on, and the powers of hell cannot conquer it. Gates of hell, some of the NIV, gates of hell cannot stand, right? It's this idea that on this moment. How you answered that question, which is the question of all questions, right? In terms of our faith, it's got to get into your heart. Well, who do you say that I am? Matter of fact, it's the only question worth answering. And if you really want to get down to the bottom of it, at the end of your life and at the end of this whole deal, it's the only question you're going to be asked that you need an answer for. Okay, we all believe that we spend eternity somewhere. Absolutely. And it's how you answer this question that matters. That's the truth. So who do you say that I am is the question of all questions. He says, and this, how you answer this, and of course the way Peter answered it, this is what I'm going to build my church on. Now, believe it or not, Jesus gets soberingly crystal clear with his disciples. He doesn't say don't talk about it, don't tell anybody I'm the Messiah because he's ashamed of it or because of anything. He tells them don't say anything because he's getting ready to tell them what that really means. He's getting ready to tell them what that actually represents. What does being the Christ really look like? So here's what he says. This is in Mark 31. Jesus began to tell them that the Son of Man must suffer many terrible things. He's going to be rejected by the elders, the leading priests and the teachers of the law. He will be killed, but 3 days later, he would rise from the dead. I mean, you can't get in 3 verses, 3 sentences or 2 sentences, you can't get any more clear than that. But as he's talking about this openly with his disciples, Peter took him aside and began to, what's the word? Read it out loud. Reprimand him, Jesus, for saying such things. You remember how we talked about how Jesus handled things when people are demanding of him? It's not great, right? He begins to reprimand Jesus for saying such things. Matter of fact, Matthew again gives us the insight. Matthew says that Peter says, heaven forbid it, Lord. This will never happen to you. Hashtag not today, right? Not on my watch, is what Peter was saying. You come back to Mark, and you see Jesus' response. He turned and looked at his disciples and reprimanded Peter. Get away from me, Satan. I don't know if you've been called Satan before. It's unnerving. I can't imagine the weight of Jesus saying it. And again, he says, you're seeing this only from a human point of view, not from God's. What an interesting contrast that so quickly we go from Peter, wow, Peter, God revealed that to your heart, that I am the Messiah. Let me tell you what it really means. And it was so different from what Peter wanted the Messiah to mean that he reprimands Jesus. Stop talking. Stop talking foolishness. That's not going to happen. And he has to call it out like, that is just a human's point of view. You cannot see what God sees. You are only focused on the path of your human point of view that you see. So when your faith is tested, again, going back to this, what did we say the first couple weeks? Fear is the opposition of faith. And by the way, preservation, not just of your own life, but preservation of how you think life's supposed to work out is one of the hardest things to let go of. Preservation of how you think life's supposed to unfold and work out is one of the hardest things to finally release and give to God, so that while they're talking about the Messiah, while they're talking about this is what the Messiah, and he tells them as clear as Messiah for Dummies book would tell you, right? I'm going to get killed. They're going to reject me. It's going to be a betrayal. But don't worry. I'm coming back in 3 days. And they can't hear it. They can't even listen to it. Why? Because they are so fixated. All they can see is what they think it should look like. And quite frankly, you're going to see the rest of Mark where Jesus tries to be clear several more times to just help his disciples finally get and see and get in their heart, what is it really going to look like? It's not going to look the way you thought it was going to look. So Peter's reprimanded Jesus. Jesus has now reprimanded Peter in front of the disciples. And we close Mark with this teaching moment. Jesus decides to bring people around. And he's no longer talking openly and clearly the way he was. But he brings people around to sort of give them this quick teaching moment based on what he's just dealt with the disciples. Here's what he says. Calling the crowd to join him, disciples, he says, if anybody wants to be my follower, you must give up your own way. Take up my cross, trying to be clear, and follow me. Then he goes on to say, if you try to hang on to your life, you're going to lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake or for the sake of the good news, the gospel, again, how Mark started this whole thing, you will save it. And he goes on to say, and what benefit you have you gain the whole world but lose your soul? What if it all works out the way you thought it was going to work out, but you get nothing? Right? It's empty. Is there anything worth more than your soul? And then he says, if anyone's ashamed of me and my message in these adulterous and sinful days, the Son of Man will be ashamed of that person when he returns in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. Jesus said, I know it's not going to look the way you want it to look, but don't be ashamed of that. Don't be ashamed of that. Don't be ashamed of me. This thing's not going to unfold the way you thought it was going to unfold, but don't be ashamed of that. That's what he's basically saying. Trying to help them understand. It's clear. He was as crystal clear as he could be, and they couldn't hear it. And then he goes on. Now, how are we going to close this out? Well, I just want you to see this. This who do you say that I am? This really comes back to kind of this idea of sacrificially, what does it look like to lay down your way so that you can gain the life God wants for you? What does it look like to when you answer this question, who do you say that I am, right? Now you're going to have fear. Fear is going to be that opposition. But when you answer this question, one of the hardest things you're going to have to do is lay down how you thought things were supposed to work out. How you thought things were going to be. I'll share very quickly from my own personal testimony, which I don't share a ton, not in detail, but it's not because I'm ashamed of it. It's just that I get to talking and it gets to be an hour later. But in short, I was just like anybody else. Like in my young 20s and my mid 20s and even late 20s, like I had a pretty good idea of how I wanted life to work out and how I thought it was supposed to work out. And now you gotta remember, I'm a Christian. Like I was a Christian since I was a fetus. Right? Like that's what my parents would say. So I was a Christian like my whole life. But I had an idea of what life was supposed to look like, and I was pretty sure, my prayers were just like anybody else's. Hey God, this is what I think life was supposed to look like, so I'm pretty sure you're on board. Right? Like that's kind of how that works. And I've shared with you many times that I was never going to work for the church. I didn't want to do it. The church was the worst place in the world. I was a Christian. I went to church, and I loved the church, but I didn't want to work for the church. Church was horrible to work for. I actually wanted to make money. And so, even when I surrendered to ministry, okay, even when I went through this pinnacle moment of surrendering to ministry, like giving up what I thought my life was supposed to be to take his path, I'll be honest, I still had a pretty good version of what I wanted that path to look like. I still, in my early 30s, had a pretty good system of like, yeah, I gave it all up for God, but I got a pretty good idea of how it's going to work out for me. I want you to know, none of it worked out that way. None of it did. As a matter of fact, when I'm honest with people, I tell them, quite frankly, the moment I surrendered to his way, that path really led me to some of the deepest hurts that I've ever experienced, some of the hardest heartbreaks to get over, some of the biggest challenges to my faith came from surrendering to that path. And yet, it is nothing compared to the joy and satisfaction and fullness of life that I currently experience because I chose that path. Does that make sense? Like it's nothing compared to. I mean, like my life is so much infinitely better than even my original plans. I was barely able to make my original plans work, and they weren't even that good. Right? So it's so much better. But you get a little bit older. I'm going to turn 50 next month. Y'all be kind, all right? I'm going to turn 50 next month. I mean, it's staring at me down the barrel, right? And I'm telling you right now, like when the people ask me now, like what plans I have and what I'm doing, I'm just like, I got plans. It's called hold on. You know? It's hold on, because I don't know what God's going to do. I have plans, but man, when you get a little bit of wisdom under your belt, man, you just start learning to hold them so open-handedly. You just hold them like this. You're just like, okay, God, I got some ideas of what I like to do, but they are wide open to changing. Why? Because I'm so much more on this side of my life. Again, not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. I don't hear that. But on this side of following God's plans, I'm so much more committed to following and staying in his plans. Because mine have failed me so often. And my version of how things are supposed to look, I've had to give them up and give them up and give them up, where finally I'm like, I don't even want to pick them up. I'm okay with just going with where he wants me to go, doing with what he wants me to do. Boy, I'm sure wish I could just have done that when I was 20. You know, but everybody learns at their own pace. I will just say this, that every time fear rises up, fear of losing out what you thought it was supposed to look like, fear, it's not fear of losing your life. It's not like this, sometimes it is life and death, but for most of us, it's not going to be life and death. It's just the life you thought you deserved, or you thought was going to work out, or you thought was supposed to look like this. That's what it is. That's what has to die in order for you to begin to experience the life that God has for you. You got to put that to rest. He said, take up that cross and follow me. And again, he was trying to be as clear and as forthcoming. He'd already been crystal clear, and they were like, nah, we ain't listening to that at all. He did it as best he could. And you'll see even in more chapters coming up, continuing to leak that out, continuing to nudge them along so that they would eventually, okay, we know the story, eventually the disciples get it. It gets in here. It gets it. They change the world by the power of God and the church. But early on in these stages, man, they're fighting the same battle we fight, which is we think it's about the bread. We think it's about the bread. And he ends this chapter with this revelation. Now again,